Not to be confused with the tedious first entry in Microid's Still Life series, Postmortem One Must Die is an adventure game developed by Koobazaur. The game appears to draw inspiration from The Walking Dead and To the Moon in particular. Resultantly, rather than pixel hunting or the improbable combination of various mundane items, the gameplay is based almost exclusively around dialogue and text-based resources. It's designed to make you grapple with your beliefs and morals, and though it lacks the emotional impact of its influences, it certainly succeeds in providing food for thought. Borrowing heavily from the history of the Troubles in Ireland, the game is set at the end of the 19th century in the fictional nation of Galicia, a country torn by civil strife as rapid industrialization and progressive legislation brings innumerable social grievances to the fore. You play as an agent of death, which mixes things up a bit. This, combined with close observation of the title, engenders the suspicion that you may not be attending a fundraising gala for social purposes, and sure enough, you are capable of ending the game at any time by arbitrarily selecting a victim, as you are in fact instructed to do by the powers that be. I take issue with that particular part because it trivializes the premise, and doesn't make much sense besides. It doesn't really detract from the experience as a whole, though. Visually, the game is rough around the edges. Literally, in fact, you can see jagged edges on partitioning walls very plainly. There are also some blurry textures in what is a rather small environment, as well as the occasional typo. The isometric movement doesn't handle particularly well either, but I feel that these are fairly superficial flaws given the mechanics and the purpose of the game. It does possess a pleasing and fitting soundtrack punctuated with classical pieces, and the ambient sound does its job well enough. The biggest detractor in terms of immersion is the lack of NPCs. The ones that are there are well fleshed out, but what you essentially have is a fundraiser hosted by a wealthy and influential businessman, attended by a grand total of 7 people, among them the host himself, a waiter, a serving boy, and an agent of death. That leaves 3 guests, 2 of which donated items to be sold rather than actual funds, which essentially makes this gala comparable to Live Aid being performed to a private audience of Bob Geldof. The environment needs populating with filler NPCs to make it seem less removed from reality. If the premise was that you were there to make a difference by ending one life, rather than to kill someone because oh no reason really, their presence wouldn't create any plot issues and interaction with them could be minimal. I must however stress that the game did impress me, particularly with the nature of the dialogue. Conversations in the game are dynamic rather than systematic. You might ask people the same questions, but you'll get different responses based on what you say, and you often won't revisit certain branches of dialogue once they've been terminated. The characters will often point out when you have discussed something with them already, which is something a lot of adventure games miss. You can also influence the characters with your own opinions on issues, such as the central conflict between the so-called Old Ages and New Ages, the former a traditionalist movement with working class roots, the latter a progressive industrialist faction dominated by the wealthy. The characters represent the whole scale on this particular issue, from the apathetic to the zealous, and thanks to the wide range of dialogue options, you can project your opinions onto the character you play, and in turn influence the thoughts of those in the in-game world, which forms a satisfying role-playing experience. The characters themselves don't elicit the same sentimentality as those in To the Moon, for example, but Postmortem thrives more on challenging you to take a stance on relevant issues than it does on emotional manipulation. Within minutes of starting the game, I was struggling to argue that a business exists for the community as well as its shareholders, regardless of size. And the introspection only goes deeper, to a fault in fact. Throughout the course of the game, you'll discuss industrialization, working conditions, monopolization, classism, animal and human dissections, preservation of culture, immigration, peaceful protest versus violent protest, apathy, the motives behind the fundraiser itself and gender equality, not forgetting that you're essentially playing God, choosing who lives and who dies. The game's comprehensive approach to social issues of the late 19th century can be overwhelming at times, to the point where the large number of prominent issues becomes a talking point itself within the game. And so, like the textures, the game's message could be accused of lacking focus at times. Though I should point out that there is a notebook tool which helpfully summarizes not only the complex relations between the characters, but also their allegiances or lack thereof, their views on issues that are of interest to them, and also the text sources that are littered around the manor. Ranging from newspaper articles to propaganda leaflets to a piece of satirical fiction, these sources are brilliantly crafted to help and create a very believable history and give a good impression of the tense atmosphere. Postmortem is a fairly short game. It took me 2 hours to complete, after a very thorough check for additional sources and dialogue options, but this isn't taking into account the replayability, which it certainly has. Without spoiling the ending too much, most characters have an issue you can influence them on one way or another, and the future of Galicia will ultimately be decided by not only who you choose to kill, but how you influence those left alive, which leaves room for multiple potential outcomes, each of which are explored in just as much detail as was given to the history behind the story, and it's a brilliant touch. Not only because of the fact that it's more rewarding, but also because it encapsulates the whole idea of whether you can make more of an impact by talking to people than you can by killing someone, which is arguably the crux of the game. It challenges you to prove that you know best, to show that your code of ethics and politics can make the situation better than it might otherwise have been. I've almost exhausted what I have to say on Postmortem. You enter a society that's reached a complicated and tempestuous focal point, confronted with 6 ideological representatives. You can talk to them for a while, but eventually one of them must die. You can select your target at random if you like. There are no obvious villains or heroes, and random selection is arguably the fairest method, but you will be expected to justify your choice, and it will have drastic repercussions whether you want it to or not. I mean, it's fairly ugly except for the character portraits, but there's food for thought in this game, and I enjoyed it a great deal. Postmortem One Must Die is available from Desura, or you can buy it from the developer's website for a price of your choosing. It's been greenlit as well, so look forward to it appearing on Steam at some time. If you're looking for a thought-provoking game, look no further, enjoy this one.